You can never get away from the love of enemies, at least not in the New Testament. That's something I think we discovered again this past Thursday, and that we're going to continue looking at in our ongoing study of the book of Acts. A handful of us might know, yeah, Jesus says this thing about loving your enemies in the Sermon on the Mount. It's a couple of verses in the gospel, and then we can just sort of forget it and just talk about how do we get to heaven, that kind of thing, except we can't. Not only does Jesus teach love of your enemies as sort of a central precept in the Sermon on the Mount and Luke's version, the Sermon on the Plain, Jesus grounds our calling to love our enemies in the character of God, because God loves God's enemies, that God loves even those who are dead set, turned around and turned away from God. And that doesn't disappear when the Gospel's finished. The New Testament community, the book of Acts, it tells the story of the early church, doubles down on that, especially in the scene and in the big story we looked at this last week in Acts chapter 9. We're introduced again to a guy named Saul, and we first met Saul as the guy who's holding the coats when this angry lynch mob is stoning Stephen, the first martyr, to death. They're all throwing rocks at him to kill him, and there's Saul, who is glad to see Stephen gotten rid of, but is just holding their coats. So he's nodding in approval without saying he got his hands dirty. And then, after that movement, that sort of like spurs Saul on to think, man, I could get away with a whole bunch of persecution of these Christians. He's convinced that Christians are terrible, dangerous, wrong. They're blaspheming against God because they're worshiping Jesus, and you should only worship God. They're besmirching the temple. They're upending all the ways he understood how things worked between him and God, between God and people. And he sees Christians as a threat. It's a reminder, as we said in Bible study, of that line by Blaise Pascal, that people never do evil so cheerfully and completely as when they're doing it with a religious conviction. There's Saul, who's convinced he's the good guy and the Christians are dangerous. And if you're convinced your enemy is terrible and awful and despicable, it becomes really easy to tell yourself you're allowed to do terrible and awful and despicable things against them because they're so bad. So there's Saul. He's got permission now to go out to surrounding cities, find Christians, and bring them back in handcuffs and bound to be put on trial in Jerusalem. Men, women, anybody who he finds who are followers of Jesus. So he's on his way to actively harass and arrest and possibly to kill more Christians. He's on the road, and there he's struck dumb and knocked off his high horse, literally knocked off the animal he's riding on the road to Damascus. And this voice comes from heaven, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Why are you hunting me down? And Saul goes, who are you? And the voice says, I'm Jesus, whom you're persecuting. Now, of course, Saul doesn't think he's actually attacking Jesus. He thinks Jesus is long dead, but that these followers of Jesus, that Jesus so closely identifies with his followers. You're hurting me when you're hurting those other people. Saul loses his eyesight and hears a vision that says, go into the city and wait for a messenger who will tell you what you're supposed to do. So this voice out of nowhere grabs Saul's attention, sends him into the city and says, wait for further instructions, right? This could have been the time for Jesus, if God were intending on vengeance or a policy of destroy your enemies, to just zap Saul on the road, right? Clearly, God's got the capacity to target people. God knows exactly where Saul is. This could have been the time for a well-placed lightning bolt, no more Saul. But that's not God's policy towards enemies. God has this way of reaching out to enemies and transforming them rather than obliterating them. So meanwhile, while Saul is getting led back into town and he can't see, so the guys who were part of his entourage are leading him into the city, Jesus speaks to a Christian in the city where Paul is being led to, in Damascus, a guy named Ananias. And Jesus says, this vision of the risen Jesus says, Ananias, here I am. He says, that's what you say when God speaks to you. I want you to go to a particular city, to a particular street in town here, and find a man named Saul, and I'm going to ask you to pray over him, and he'll be healed by your presence. He's lost his eyesight, and you are supposed to heal him and tell him the good news about Jesus. And he's going to become a member of this community of the followers of Jesus. And Ananias goes, hold on, Jesus, are you not aware of what this guy has done? I've heard of what this guy's done. He's rounding people up. He's come here to harass us and take more people in handcuffs back, to put them on trial back in Jerusalem. And you want me to what now? And the response comes, you got to trust. He's someone I've claimed. I've chosen him. And yeah, there will be a cost, not punishment, but following me is going to take its own cost for Saul. He will end up paying dearly. He'll end up suffering for following me. So don't pretend that this is sort of an easy life or a get out of jail free card. To follow Jesus is going to mean the risk, the possibility of suffering, of self-giving love. Saul's going to get his share of that as well. But your job is to love him, to receive him as somebody that I say already belongs. So Ananias goes and meets Saul, and the words out of his mouth, as Luke tells it, he calls him Brother Saul, already receiving him as a member of the family of Jesus, already welcoming him. Brother Saul, Jesus has sent me to heal you and to tell you the good news. And as he prays for him and lays hands on him, Saul's eyesight is healed. Something like scales falls from his eyes, and he comes to faith. He's baptized, and he becomes a follower of Jesus. In fact, he becomes so convinced that he starts going around to the local synagogues trying to convince other people that Jesus really is the Messiah. Something has changed for Saul. What I think is so powerful about this story is, even though it's going to take the rest of the Christian community a while to sort of wrap their heads and hearts around this, right? There's still going to be some pushback for a while. Wait, this guy, he was our enemy. Maybe this is all part of an elaborate sting operation. Maybe he hasn't really come to the faith. Maybe he's trying to trick us. Maybe he's trying to infiltrate us from the inside. There were some who were really, really cautious about welcoming Saul, and people who were still really, really bitter about his role in Stephen's death. But God's the one who finds him while he's still an enemy, this Saul, and claims him and loves him and transforms him. And it's on the basis of God's claim on him. It's on the fact that Jesus says, I've claimed you for my family, that everybody else has to get on board eventually. It sometimes takes a while for us to get on board to where Jesus is already moving. Saul will end up going by his Greek name, Paul, and ends up being the guy who writes, like half of the New Testament, including in his letters a pretty significant theme that God's love reached out to us while we were enemies. That God didn't just love us when we were well-behaved, when we had turned to Jesus first and prayed our little sinner's prayer, but that even while we were actively turned away from God, God's love reached out to us. Christ died for us. God's love got through to us, and God reaches to turn us, because God's policy toward enemies is to love them, reconcile them, and transform them into members of the family. That's what happens in Acts chapter 9, continuing a through line of exactly the way Jesus saw the world in the Gospels as well, the way you and I are called to face the world as well. Because Jesus' policy toward enemies is to love them and transform them. That's called to be our way in the world. Sometimes you and I are the ones called to be like Ananias, to reach out to people we don't like, or don't you know what they've done? Don't you know their backstory? Don't you know all the terrible things I know about them? Those things never stop God from reaching out to people in love. That's powerful. In fact, that's what changes the world. Join us for more conversation as we move forward into the rest of Acts 9 and into Acts chapter 10 this Thursday at 1 o'clock at Community of Christ. If you can't join us in person, catch up with these video summaries. See you along the way.